Why is this one of the most famous papers in the 20th century? Well, in the course of empiricist philosophy from Hume and Kant onward, when Kant read Hume's arguments, he wrote The Prolegomena in Any Future Metaphysics, which I had a whole class on that, so I do know what I'm talking about. And this had to do with salvaging metaphysics and salvaging the doing of science. So because in Kant's mind, if we didn't have a way to justify some metaphysical claims, we wouldn't really be able to do either metaphysics or science. And so he had an enterprise that he undertook to justify and salvage science. And one thing that he thought you could do was to divide up types of claims or types of truths into two types. And this originally goes back to Hume's matters of fact and relations of ideas. And this will become eventually the analytic synthetic distinction. So basically, this is just two types of statements or truths. Synthetic truths are those that relate to the world, what Hume would call the matters of fact, right? That billiard ball A is there and billiard ball B is there, and they hit one another. That is a matter of fact. Analytic truths are truths that relate to true by definition or true in virtue of the meaning alone. And so the idea was, well, if we can divide truths into these two categories, maybe we could salvage what we are doing in science, in physics, biology, psychology. So basically, think of it on the, it'll be reverse for y'all out there because y'all are in reverse world. And the analytic side, you would have math, you would have logic, you would have semantics, okay? These would be disciplines that would be in the analytic tradition that typically we're studying things that don't relate to sense data and experience and empirical data. And then over on the synthetic side of the disciplines, you could think of things like physics, biology, psychology, supposedly, right? They're studying phenomena in the world. And so could we maintain this rigid sort of distinction and thereby salvage philosophy? And this is one of the first areas where I think Kant will even say, well, it's kind of unclear what philosophy fits into. Does philosophy fit into the domain of the a priori? And so we could put philosophers like Kant, Plato, Heidegger, Leibniz, right, as philosophers doing the a priori, studying things that are not dependent on sense data. And then we could have in the other side philosophers like Hume or A.J. Ayer or Bertrand Russell, right, who are studying the supposedly hard sciences or whatever. And the point of the paper is to analyze whether this distinction, which is part of the maintenance of the empiricist tradition, right, whether this distinction actually holds, or does it actually break down? And if it breaks down, then in fact we are still in the dilemmas and the skepticism of Hume that he originally put forward. So in other words, we don't have a justification for our beliefs. And so the first thing that he does in the two Dogmas of Empiricism is that he goes into discussing the fact that matters of fact and relations of ideas, same thing as the analytic synthetic distinction that Kant will pose, are faced with many problems from the outset. And so different positivists and Vienna Circle philosophers gave attempts at trying to resolve this problem. And he uses as his key figure Rudolf Carnap. And so Carnap poses the first sort of attempt to resolve the problem of, well, what does it mean for a statement to be analytic, right? So we know that the synthetic statements are going to relate to experience and relating experience to something in the domain of ideas. But when we're talking about these analytic truths, what does analyticity mean? How do we define that? How do we explain that? And so first it gets into the question of meaning. Okay, well, we know what an analytic truth is by virtue of the meaning of the words. So true by definition. And then it turns out, well, now wait a minute. When we say that words mean, this might sound on the surface like an easy answer. Oh, well, we all know what words mean. Think of the word concept fallacy. Think of the reductionist attitude of a lot of these people. The heretics always use the word concept fallacy. This is like an atheist version of the word concept fallacy. Well, words just mean what they mean. Well, obviously we can see the problem with that, right? Words just mean what they mean. Sounds a little circular. Yeah, exactly, right? So we're going to basically walk through steps. That's what Quine's going to do in this paper. He's going to walk through a series of steps that someone like Carnap, as a representative of the positivist empiricist tradition, trying to salvage science and hard sciences through analyticity, as distinct from synthetic statements. And so first what he does is he says, all right, let's look at a few examples of how meaning actually becomes vague, because he introduces these ideas of extensionality and intentionality, and that when we extend or restrict what we're predicating about in linguistic philosophy, it can become very vague. So just to say that analytic statements are the statements that are true by definition actually doesn't tell us anything, because when we look at what it means to define a word, we find that that also gets very vague. And he gives examples of situations where we can have the same intended meaning, but the words themselves are ambiguous without knowing the intentional context. For example, all things with a heart, all things with kidneys. The intention is different, and so the extension and the intention can differ, you see. So in other words, I might mean the same thing by the two phrases, but the reference themselves are ambiguous. And so it doesn't work to just to use the ideas of extension and an intention from linguistic philosophy to define analyticity. So the next thing is, well, let's try something else. What if we say that it's logical necessity? Logical necessity for analyticity would be that all x are x, all x are y, and these rely on the definition of analyticity being logical necessity or synonymy. So synonyms here are what's the next solution that's introduced. Maybe it's just synonyms. So you could say, for example, in parentheses, the number 27, and then if you write out 27, right? See, those are synonyms. They signify the same thing. But that doesn't work, because simply saying that the numerals 27 equal TWENTYSEVEN, saying that they mean the same thing doesn't actually grant you any knowledge of what analyticity means, you see. So it can't be synonymity. And then we can even give examples of synonyms like bachelor. When I say the word bachelor, do you automatically assume an unmarried man? Or do you assume a degree, right? A bachelor's degree. And these are some of the examples that Quine uses in the paper, and he's just basically giving defeaters for everything that the positivists and Carnap put forward as a resolution. And he says, no, that actually doesn't work, because that relies on this, right? And so then the next one is they bring in the, well, what if we used Leibniz's notion of salva veritate, which is to salvage the truth value. So maybe an analytic statement is just a statement where the truth value is interchangeable with something else. And so by that, what we end up meaning is cognitive synonyms. And this also won't work, because necessity is key, but necessity for example, let's say all brothers are brothers. If we say that that's analytic and we say that it's true by necessity, that actually doesn't tell us what necessity is, because now analyticity is defined as logical necessity, and logical necessity is self-referencing and defined as analyticity. So we don't know if we have the right list, by the way, of all of the quote analytic statements, even if we did grant this as the definer. So in other words, to know that we could list or have a correct list of the analytic statements, which this empiricist position would require us to have a decision criteria. But a decision criteria would be prior to the actual listing of each analytic truth, you see. And so again, it becomes circular. And analyticity basically ends up after Quine's paper being dead. Now there's more examples that Carnap and his crew are going to give. And I need my whiteboard, because this is going to be a lot easier if I write this out, because This paper is long and technical, but if you grasp this part here, this is the essence of this whole paper. And we'll see the force of this paper right here towards the end here. So to make a few concluding points before I draw this out for you. So remember that empirical truths, right? In the empiricist tradition, some truths, like analytic truths, are not learned by experience. And the division originally is used by Kant, summarizing Hume. For Kant, philosophy then uncovers this distinction. It's a job of philosophy to do and suss out the analytic-synthetic distinction. But remember, we also don't have a decision criteria. So there's another problem there. And so that's different than the analytic truths, where they're analyzing pure concepts or pure ideas. So Quine is then answering the question, or asking the question, is philosophy anything really different from anything else? Because remember, the positivists, the empiricists, they want a unified science. They want a unified language, a unified approach to these things. Thus, our beliefs, according to Quine, end up being more like a web of beliefs, all of which are connected, and none of them stand alone in a privileged position as a brute fact or are divorced from the other facts. And you can see this from linguistic philosophy. So a large portion of this paper is focused on linguistic philosophy and arguments from linguistic philosophy, which you've actually probably heard me make in many debates. If you've listened or followed over the last few years, I'm actually using a lot of these kind of linguistic type arguments, predication arguments, class arguments, set arguments, all of which are actually in different places in this paper. So if Quine ends up being a holist, an epistemic holist, in that he doesn't believe that there are brute facts, sense data that give us raw, uninterpreted experience that's meaningful. In other words, later philosophy will raise the question, like Sellers does, the myth of the given, which we covered in that brief video. In other words, the fact that there's a seeing of red in an object out there in the world, there's no such thing as a raw, uninterpreted piece of data that tells me that seeing as red is being caused by a red object in the external world. Right? So number one, I don't even know if in the empiricist tradition I can justify belief in an external world. But beyond that, there is the myth of the givenness of the experience, that the content of the external world is causally granting me meaningful information about an object that is red. So my having of the experience of that object is red assumes that there is a object with redness causing that empirical data to be imprinted upon me. And so Sellers will call this the myth of the given. And by the end of this paper, Quine will actually say, he doesn't say myth of the given, but he says there are multiple elements that empiricists believe in about epistemology and metaphysics that they cannot justify, and they're all myths. So he will actually include physicality of objects. He will include that there are forces of nature. These are all myths, and he says they have the same status as the gods of Homer in terms of justification. And this is an argument you've heard me make to many, many atheists. I'd forgotten that he makes this argument at the end of the paper. Right? How many times have I told the atheists, oh, you're making an appeal to universals, abstract ideas, concepts, math, numbers. Do you understand that in terms of justification, they have the exact same status as fairy tales? So you like to say that theists believe in fairy tales, flying spaghetti monsters, and then you appeal to the things like universal concepts, like laws of logic, which for you actually have the same ontological status as fairy tales, because as Quine in the last 500 years of your tradition admit, they cannot be justified epistemically. So back to the paper then. The next move is semantics. All right, well, maybe we can go to semantics and I think Carnap makes this move. Maybe words themselves will tell us what analytic statements are. Analyticity then will be relying on linguistic, semantical constructs. The problem with this, of course, is that it also is circular. In other words, if we go to lexicographers and we look at definability, we're using words to define words. So we're saying that lexicographers or people that write dictionaries now are the ones that will authoritatively tell us what an analytic statement is. But an analytic statement is relying on the rules and constructs of grammar and language, which the rules and constructs of grammar and language are also relying on grammar and language. The point is that analyticity is circular. And as you know, if you are an empiricist, and this is an attempt to rescue and salvage the foundationalist tradition, right? We need a bedrock, a foundational belief to start our empirical endeavor of science upon. If the bedrock is circular, then it falls apart. You're no longer a foundationalist. Does that make sense? You see? So semantical rules are supposedly, semantical rules and syntax are going to give us vocabulary, grammar, and these semantical rules are supposedly going to give us the principle. But this won't work because the lexicon relies on words and semantical rules to write the lexicon. So the logic of semantical rules cannot be divorced from, quote, facts. So in other words, this is the next devastating point is, if you're going to say that analyticity relies on definitions of people that write lexicons and they write dictionaries, how is there an analytical definition of bed that's separated from an actual bed in the world? And likewise for any object. It doesn't seem possible, right, to be able to linguistically define bed without objects in the world known as beds. So thus, you can begin to see how the analytic-synthetic distinction would actually break down, especially when you go to lexicographers and semantical rules. How can you define bed without a synthetic truth or an empirical sense data truth relating to beds? Right? It's obvious, right? It's a no-brainer that that's not going to work. And so what this breaks down to, in other words, at this point, it breaks down. If then the result is pragmatism, then empiricism is since empiricism is about observational accounts, and we have a circle that results, according to the argument in Quine's paper, then there's no real foundationalist account of any of the point in the circle. So let's look at the circle and how it worked. And it starts, as we said, with analytic. So an analytic statement is a statement true by definition. And by definition, we said, all right, we're going to look then at meaning. And then we say, okay, well, what's meaning mean? Well, meaning has a reference to synonyms. And synonyms had a reference to substitution or interchangeability. And all that meant was semantic rules. And semantic rules had a reference to lexicons and grammar. And lexicon and grammars tell us what is analytic. But as Quine has in this excellent paper shown, do we see the problem here? Now, why is this a problem? It's a problem because it's a circle. And no empiricist who is by default a foundationalist in their epistemology can admit circles. Where is the self-evident, raw, brute fact that we bootstrap, right? Empiricism is an epistemic bootstrapping project that we begin with. Which one of these is going to be the foundation? Well, you see that this is not going to work because anywhere that you step into the circle to pick out your foundational starting point, it's actually going to be referencing some other thing, you see. And so what this does is show that there's no foundational starting point for linguistic philosophy, and empiricism defaults to linguistic philosophy to try to rescue analytic truths, to be the grounds of this analytic synthetic distinction, to salvage science. Well, if it's a circle and there's no foundational starting point, then now what are we going to have to do? We're going to have to say that actually maybe this whole empiricist endeavor is a failure. And in fact, our beliefs do not work as blocks stacked on top of one another, but as a web of beliefs, holistic epistemology. This moves us in the direction of coherence, not advocating a total coherence theory of secular philosophers. I'm just making a point about that our beliefs do not operate like blocks stacked on top of one another. They operate more like a web. And this, of course, moves us in the direction of transcendental argumentation. Now, there was one more point that's the strongest point of the paper. And then there's a next point about dogma. The second dogma, for any sentence S, there are sets of observations that would confirm or disconfirm the sentence. That's the next dogma. And the analytic statements are the ones that are thus the ones that you confirm. So the true beliefs are the ones that are confirmation, right? Verification or confirmation that you get. Now, as we saw in the stream a couple days ago, where we went into the ambiguity behind evidentialism and verification and proof, we don't have any idea on empiricist grounds what sufficient evidence and what sufficient verification and proof is, especially when they tried to bring in things like probability. I mean, what is the sufficient proof that verifies or disconfirms the belief? 80%, 50%? You see, thus it's very arbitrary. And so we always know that what confirms or disconfirms, according to Quine, is in the context of our worldviews as a whole. In other words, one specific proposition, you're not going to know that a series of other propositions related to that proposition necessarily confirm or deny it outside of the context of your beliefs as a whole. And so this is where he gets into epistemic holism. And that there's a couple more points at the end. This brings us to the end of the paper, where Quine makes the point that you've heard me make about, so science then is not a purely brute facts, raw data enterprise. If you saw the Sam Harris critique that we just did of the Brute Facts podcast that he and Jordan Peterson did, you'll notice that this is immediately relevant to that, right? Jordan Peterson was correctly questioning Sam Harris on the is-ought distinction, and Harris said, well, all I want to do is basically save science as the foundation of epistemology, and I need a bootstrap project. I think they even mentioned at one point in that podcast, bootstrapping, that will allow me to erect a starting point. I just need some raw, brute fact of data that comes in, which again ignores the challenge of the myth of the given from Sellers. But it relates back to Quine's paper, because remember, science, he points out, is not a purely analytical discipline. Science is not a purely synthetic discipline. And and philosophy is interesting because it tells us that precisely that either of these disciplines break down. There's not a hard divide between the analytic and the synthetic. They necessitate one another. This is a false either-or dialectic that the empiricists set up to try to save their project. And it should be obvious because science depends on language and experience to do what it does. Obviously. How many times have you heard me say this? It's the argument I made to Infidel Pharaoh in the debate that we had, right? He's saying, oh, science doesn't have anything to do with language and philosophy. It's just hard facts. And the whole point of Quine's paper is there's no such thing as a hard fact, a brute fact. And then he makes the point about webs of beliefs. And then the great point at the end, which, again, you could say that for Quine, he's making this point about the empiricist tradition is going to have to give up the notion of epistemic justification. This is why you hear me always arguing the same stuff with the atheists, because I'm just repeating the kinds of arguments that are in this, namely that as an empiricist, there isn't really any system or justification for beliefs that start with sense experience and then extrapolate to claims beyond sense experience. And so the notion of there being a meaningful, quote, physical object is just as much a fairy tale or a fantasy as theism. The external world, the givenness of sense data, the notion of a meaningful, quote, physical object, forces, sets, numbers, universals, all of these things that are used by the atheist, empiricist, materialist are not justified. And so what does Quine say? He says, yes, strictly speaking, they have for us, if we're consistent, the status of the gods of Homer. Did you hear that? Logic has the equal status of fairy tales. External world has the equal status of fairy tales. Laws of nature have the status of fairy tales. Numbers have the status, epistemic status of fairy tales. Set theories, classes of objects have the epistemic status for a consistent empiricist of fairy tales. This is devastating. And so this is the surrendering of justified true belief and yet your problem. It is the surrendering of justification. And that's why Quine's paper says we might as well move into just pragmatism. In other words, there isn't justification for these principles anymore. Do you remember the debate with Matt Dillahunty? These are the arguments I made to Matt Dillahunty. Matt's belief in immaterial, invariant, transcendental categories and principles is of equal epistemic status as fairy tales. So Quine's resolution is, let's just give up justification. In other words, we're going to surrender this. And he says, let's move into psychology, psychologism, pragmatism. That's it. Now, in Father Deacon's paper, he gets into critiquing whether Quine actually has a coherent move when he does that. And in fact, that will break down. And we will get into that paper in the near future when we look at his Father Deacon's response and critique, because obviously this will not work. I mean, if we're going to surrender justification and objectivity, logic, argumentation, rationality, and we're just doing psychology, then now we're in the dilemma of psychologism. And by the way, debate becomes impossible. So that comes at a heavy cost. Okay, there's no such thing as debate anymore. If we're surrendering truth value, standards, objectivity. I mean, that's all out the window. So if the atheist wants to go in that route, if he's going to be consistent, then he's got to drop the microphone. He has there's no way he can argue. This is the surrendering of argumentation, you see, because now no claims can be justified. If no claims can be justified, then debate is impossible. You have no argument to make. Anytime you argue, you will be violating your presupposition. Father Deacon's paper is in the Discord. It's called Quine and Naturalized Epistemology, I think is what it's called. It's something like that. It's Naturalized Epistemology and Quine and Naturalized Epistemology, something like that. So, and Father Deacon will basically just critique that the move towards psychologism and surrendering justification is the giving up of epistemology. He's just going to be making that point. And so this is why I've been trying to say to people and the atheists that come on here over the last several years, you realize that in academia, this is dead. The notion of justifying claims, if you're an empiricist, atheist, materialist, at least for 99% of them, you don't do philosophy anymore. Do you understand that? You guys have, the academic state of the question has moved on. And Quine's paper has basically killed the positivist Carnap Vienna Circle approach. And Quine is an empiricist. Okay, so he's not like some sort of theist or something like that. He's in that empiricist tradition. He's just like, guys, look, we're still in the same boat that David Hume raised 500 years ago. Let's just give this up. That's it.